What if tonight the world's biggest oil exporters simply stopped selling oil? Not because the oil disappeared. Not because the wells ran dry. The oil would still be underground, tankers would still be sitting in ports, refineries would still be waiting. But the exports would stop. And at first, you might not notice anything at all. Your lights would still work, planes would still fly, gas stations would still look normal. Then the inventories would begin to fall. Markets would react first. Then fuel prices. Then transportation. Then food. And eventually, the question would become much bigger than the price of gasoline. Who gets the oil that is still moving, and how long before an ordinary person feels the shortage? Because when the world's biggest suppliers stop at the same time, the crisis isn't simply about running out of oil. It's about what happens when billions of people, thousands of industries, and entire countries suddenly have to compete for the same shrinking supply. The strange thing about an oil crisis is that the first hours might feel completely normal. If every major exporter stopped shipping tomorrow, millions of barrels already stored around the world would still be sitting inside tanks, pipelines, refineries, and ships. Gas stations would not instantly run dry. Factories would not suddenly shut down. Commercial flights would not disappear from the sky. That delay is what makes the scenario dangerous. Modern economies don't run on the oil being pumped today. They run on a continuous flow: production, shipping, refining, storage, and delivery, working together with very little room for disruption. And that flow is enormous. Oil remains one of the world's most traded commodities, moving across oceans every day to supply transportation, industry, heating, chemicals, and countless products people rarely associate with petroleum. So when the exports stop, the first thing the world loses isn't gasoline. It loses certainty. But certainty is only the first thing to disappear. Because once buyers realize that the next cargo may never arrive, the world's oil system changes from a steady flow into a competition for whatever is already moving. The first reaction would happen in financial markets almost immediately. Traders would understand that a huge amount of future supply had suddenly disappeared. Oil prices could surge as buyers competed for the remaining supply, and that higher cost would begin moving through the economy long before physical shortages reached most consumers. Eventually, people would notice it at the pump. Refineries would become critical. Countries with crude in storage would try to stretch those reserves, while governments could release emergency stockpiles to calm the market. Importers would search for alternative suppliers, reroute cargoes, and compete for every available barrel. But there is a limit to how quickly the world can replace missing exports. A tanker cannot appear overnight. A refinery cannot instantly switch to every type of crude. And an oil field that was already producing near capacity cannot simply double its output because prices have risen. By the end of the first week, the crisis would no longer be about whether the world had enough oil underground. It would be about who gets the oil that is still moving. And that question would force governments to make a choice they normally try very hard to avoid. Who gets protected first when there isn't enough for everyone? The first difficult choices would not happen at the gas station. They would happen behind the scenes. Governments would begin deciding which fuel users matter most. Ambulances, food distribution, power generation, military logistics, and other essential services could move ahead of ordinary consumption. Some industries might be told to cut back. And then an unexpected problem would appear. Not every refinery can process every type of crude. A country might have oil reserves, but still lack the right crude, refinery capacity, or transport routes to turn those reserves into the fuels its economy actually needs. Having oil underground would not necessarily mean having usable fuel when it matters. And that creates a second problem most people would not see coming. The world could have millions of barrels available on paper, while some regions still face shortages of the specific fuels they need. Oil would not necessarily be where the demand is. The right crude would not necessarily be at the right refinery. And the finished fuel would not necessarily be where the trucks, ships, aircraft, and factories need it. That is when the shortage would begin spreading beyond transportation. Farmers could face higher diesel costs, factories could struggle with fuel and petroleum-based materials, shipping companies could slow operations, airlines could cut routes as fuel becomes harder to secure. The world would discover that an oil crisis is not simply about how many barrels exist. It is about where they are, what they can become, and who can reach them. By now, the shortage would stop feeling like something happening in oil markets. It would become a question of priority. A truck carrying food might get fuel while another truck waits. An airport could protect essential flights while cutting others. A factory producing critical goods might keep operating while another shuts down because its fuel allocation disappears. But there would be a deeper problem. The countries with the most oil would not automatically be the countries with the most usable fuel. Some would have crude but limited refining capacity. Others would have refineries but depend on imported crude with specific qualities. Some would have fuel but lack the shipping routes needed to move it where demand was highest. The same barrel could suddenly have very different value depending on where it goes. And that would make cooperation harder. Countries that normally trade with one another would begin protecting domestic supplies first. Export restrictions could spread. Long-standing agreements could be tested. A country might still have enough fuel for itself while refusing to send it abroad. Another might have no domestic shortage yet, but begin buying aggressively simply because it fears what comes next. The crisis would reveal something uncomfortable. When supply becomes scarce, global trade depends not only on what countries have, but on what they are willing to share. And this is where an oil shortage could become a shift in global power. Countries with domestic production would suddenly matter more. So would nations with strategic reserves, alternative energy, strong shipping networks, or the ability to reduce demand quickly. But the biggest advantage might belong to countries that can adapt without depending on a single fuel source. The pressure on remaining exporters would be enormous. They could increase production and gain influence, or protect their own reserves and watch other countries compete for what remains. Importing nations would search for new suppliers, negotiate long-term deals, and accelerate investments in alternatives. But there is a limit to how quickly any of this can happen. Electric vehicles cannot replace millions of combustion engines overnight. Renewable projects take years to build. New nuclear plants take even longer. And even an economy with abundant electricity still needs fuel and petroleum products for aviation, shipping, heavy machinery, construction, chemicals, and countless industrial processes. So the countries best positioned to survive the disruption would not necessarily be the countries with the most oil. They would be the countries with the most options. And once energy becomes a question of options rather than abundance, the balance of power begins to change. So what would really happen if every major oil exporter stopped at once? The world would not run out of oil in a single night. That is almost the least interesting part. The first shock would be psychological. Markets would react before most people ever saw an empty fuel station. Then the physical system would begin tightening. Stored supplies would be consumed, prices would rise, countries would compete for remaining cargoes, governments would prioritize essential users, transportation and industry would become more expensive. And eventually, the shortage would reach ordinary people through the systems they depend on every day. But there is another lesson hidden inside this scenario. Modern civilization is not powered by oil alone. It is powered by predictability. A tanker arriving on schedule. A refinery receiving the right crude. A truck finding affordable diesel. A farmer knowing fuel will be available when harvest begins. A factory knowing its suppliers can deliver what they promised. Break one part of that chain, and the rest can continue for a while. Break enough of it at once, and the world's greatest vulnerability is no longer how much oil exists underground. It is how dependent modern life has become on oil arriving exactly when we expect it to. And that is why the most dangerous part of an oil shortage would not be the moment the pumps finally run dry. It would be the moment the world realizes they might not be refilled.